الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله
الله أكبر بسم الله الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين والشمس وضحاها والقمر إذا تلاها والنهار إذا جلاها والليل إذا يغشاها والسماء وما بناها والأرض وما طحاها ونفس وما سواها فألهمها فجورها وتقواها قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها كذبت ثمود بطغواها إذ انبعث أشقاها فقال لهم رسول الله ناقة الله وسقياها فكذبوه فعقروها فدمدم عليهم ربهم بذنبهم فسواها ولا يخاف عقباها الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين سبح اسم ربك الأعلى الذي خلق فسوى والذي قدر فهدى والذي أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء أحوى سنقرئك فلا تنسى إلا ما شاء الله إنه يعلم الجهر وما يخفى ونيسرك لليسرى فذكر إن نفعت الذكرى سيذكر من يخشى ويتجنبها الأشقى الذي يصلى النار الكبرى ثم لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا قد أفلح من تزكى وذكر اسم ربه فصلى بل تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا والآخرة خير وأبقى إن هذا لفي الصحف الأولى صحف إبراهيم وموسى. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله. الحمد لله. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Yeah. It's broadcasting at 7:30. Okay, I'm doing.
Test, test. Test, test. Okay, so for today's class, I need one volunteer. Actually, from now on, every class I need one volunteer who's basically going to be clicking the PowerPoint for me. As you notice, I don't check this PowerPoint all the time. So I'm just going to be going from my notes, someone who can just follow along and click who's going to be good and reliable about it. Yeah? Okay, so he beat you to it. He walked up. So, alhamdulillah. All right. Do you know how to work it or no? Forward and backwards, that's it. Those are yours, yeah. Islamic law. Islamic law. Okay, just give me a second. Having a little computer problem here. Highlighted. Islamic law. 103. There we go. Bismillah. Okay. Jamil, you ready? You want to test? Okay. All right. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Wa ba'd. So we were talking so far about scholarly consensus in Islamic law, what's known as ijma'. And the example we gave was that of linguistic scholarly consensus, which is a relevant example. But at the same time, we talked about the word. Does anyone remember the word? The example we gave? That it's mistaken and the linguists say that irregardless. All right. Anyone heard it in the past week? You heard it in the past week? Oh, yeah. You heard it before, though, okay? So that's one example. Another example would be scientists as well. It's this type of scholarly consensus, right? Except with science, even though there's a consensus, it turns out to be wrong, so they have to modify it. The only difference in Islam, when there's a consensus, it's not going to be modified. So for example, astronomers, right? When they identified, most of you, when you were going to high school, how many planets were you taught that there were? 9, right? So they were 9, and then they turned into 8 plus 3 dwarf planets, right? So the thing is, they taught you 9. There was a consensus of astronomers that there are 9 planets in our solar system. Then they realized, you know what? Okay, forget that consensus. But at that time, if somebody claimed who was not an expert or didn't have any proof that, no, you know what, I don't agree with this number 9. It's something that you can't mess with, right? Because it's a consensus across the board. So that's the way it works, but the difference is in Islam, because it's divine revelation here, the basis is in divine revelation, not just in, you know, people's human thoughts. It's not going to be overruled. So this is scholarly consensus. Now here's the amazing thing about it. See, scholarly consensus is not, in Islamic law, is not just going to come out of nowhere, like through a vacuum. It's not just going to be the whims and the caprice of the scholars. They're not just going to come up with some random thing and say, okay, you know what, we want to say that eating apples is prohibited for whatever reason. It's not going to happen. Rather, whenever an ijma or a scholarly consensus does happen, it's going to be within the bounds of Islam. Right? So it's not just, see, the thing is, sometimes when they hear scholarly consensus, they get the idea of, oh, clergy in Islam. Right? That's like the Pope system. No, it's not. The difference is, the scholarly consensus in Islam is going to be arising out of a direct text, of the way of interpreting a text or making an analogy. Right? Like we talked about a little bit about analogy. So this is not just, has no basis. It has a basis in the Quran, it has a basis in the Sunnah. Right? The only difference is it's being restricted such that it's closing the doors for other people to go and make different interpretations. So that's actually a blessing. Now, from a strict understanding of this idea of scholarly consensus, if we look at the definition that we talked about, the strict definition is that each and every single expert Muslim scholar, or mujtahid, that who lives in the same era, meaning in the same time, must have a clear position on a particular case or particular issue, and there should not be a single one of them that disagrees. If even one of them disagrees, it breaks the consensus and there is no scholarly consensus. Ijma' does not exist anymore, even if one person who's a mujtahid breaks it. Right? So for example, in the time of the companions, there may be a group of companions who are saying one thing, and then there's one companion, you know, like Aisha, for example. You know, she used to take certain opinions which the vast majority of all the companions did not agree with. But she took an opinion on certain rules of Islamic law, which means that she broke the consensus because she was considered a mujtahid, right, in her field, right? So that means that every means like every across the board, in the strict sense of understanding this term, okay? In one era, taking a clear position and not a single person should be disagreeing. So another way, or a better way, or easier way to understand what is consensus is in negative terms, meaning all consensus means is there's no disagreement on this issue. Right? So alcohol is prohibited in Islam. We say that there's a clear text in the Quran, and there's hadith, and it's in the Sunnah as well. But another way that it's proven is through ijma', scholarly consensus, which is considered to be a proof. So if you say, well, there's not a single mujtahid ever who's ever said that you can go ahead and just drink alcohol for pleasure, you know, for just you want to get intoxicated or whatever it is. There's not been a single one. So that means that there's scholarly consensus in this. So there's no difference of opinion, no disagreement on this. So when we're talking about the Quran and the Sunnah, particularly, the most important, and this is a really important part, this is a very subtle point, that most students, when they study this subject, and they study ijma', they miss this point, and it's a very, very important point. And that is that when we're talking about Quran and Sunnah, what scholarly consensus or ijma' actually does is it identifies the part of the text that is certain with regards to its meaning. Remember we talked about qat'i ad-dalala, certain with regards to its meaning such that there's no difference of opinion. How do you know that it's certain? Right? That's the thing. So someone comes along and says, well, you know, you're telling me that the verse which prohibits alcohol says fajtanibuhu, right? So you stay away from it. You're telling me that that means that alcohol is prohibited. Well, you know what? I don't agree with that. I don't think that the text is saying that. And you say, no, you don't understand. The text is qat'i ad-dalala, right? It is certain. There's no doubt. There can't be a second opinion. It's certain as to what this verse means. It's clear cut. So, well, not in my opinion. So how do you establish that something is really clear-cut in the true sense of the word? You do it through consensus. Right? So if somebody comes along and says, well, I don't agree with that. So, well, okay, are you an expert scholar in terms of the sense that you're a mujtahid? No. Number one, no. Number two, even if you were, you're coming 1400 years later, and for 1300 and whatever years, no mujtahid has ever said that. So a later on, person, even if they reach a level of, let's say, ijtihad, whatever the level is, right? They cannot come and override a previous consensus. Once consensus is established, it's established and it's fixed. And that's the beauty of Islam, actually. You can't come along and all of a sudden, you get 3 mujtahids, let's say, in one area or in the world. You kill off the rest of them, and then imagine you're a tyrant or you're a dictator. You kill off the rest of them, and you got the 3 left in the world, and they're working for you. And all of a sudden, okay, you're the 3, we're going to make scholarly consensus. So you allow me to go ahead and drink alcohol. Do you allow me to? And they say, well, the fact that you have an M16 pointed to the back of my head, okay, maybe I'm going to consider it, And they say, and you allow me to go and, fornicate with all of these different women. And say, well, the fact that, you just tortured me for the last 2 years in a row, perhaps I might just give you an answer. So you understand so this is a beauty of Islam. No one can come and mess with that. And that's the beauty of scholarly consensus. So it basically specifies when a text is certain, with regards to its meaning, qat'i ad-dalala, it's established through consensus so that there cannot be any difference of opinion on this. Which means that, logically, what follows now? It follows that if the text is qat'i ad-dalala, then the scholarly consensus on this text is also qat'i ad-dalala. Which means that the principle or the process of scholarly consensus or ijma' has in terms of its proof value, it's at the level of certainty. We talked about certainty and probability, right? Qat'i and dhanni. So ijma' is qat'i, which is very important. That's the beauty of ijma' or scholarly consensus. Okay? I'll let people write that down while they're writing. Either sisters write slow or brothers just don't write. And I'm assuming the latter. So, alhamdulillah. Alright, so now moving on. The term scholarly consensus or the term ijma' sometimes has been claimed that it exists, but in reality it was only the majority of scholars who were agreeing on something. It does not necessarily indicate a consensus. And I think I gave an example of this last week. I don't recall, about wudu, right? I gave an example of this, right? So, for example, people who think that you have to perform wudu before touching the Quran. Okay, vast majority of scholars have agreed that you have to perform wudu before you touch a copy of the Quran if you're going to be reading the Quran. Right? The 4 famous schools of Islamic law, Shafi'i, Hanbali, Hanafi, Maliki, all 4 of them agree that you have to have wudu before you touch the Quran. But there's no scholarly consensus on it. There's been a few people who disagree throughout history, and they were, in the sense, mujtahids. So there is sometimes you will find people and books claiming there is ijma' on this issue. But in reality, they may be mistaken and there is no ijma'. But they thought that there was ijma'. So that's why sometimes it's unintentional. You think that it's there. So that's why it's actually better to always say, I do not know of any difference of opinion on this. You say, is there any difference of opinion? Say, you know what? This is agreed upon. I don't know of anyone who's ever differed. That's a safer statement to make in case you find out that there was one person who differed or there were 2 people who differed. Rather than making this affirmation and saying there is consensus on this issue. And this was the statement of Imam Ahmad, the founder of the Hanbali school. He said, this is what you guys should say. You shouldn't make these exaggerated claims on ijma'. Some people misunderstood his statement. He wasn't trying to say that it doesn't exist. He was criticizing people who claim that there's ijma' on something. Very quickly making the statement. He was criticizing them and saying, people should never say that. He didn't mean that it never existed. What he meant was something else. Anyway, he meant don't be so loose with this wording, you know what? So that's what he meant. Sometimes though, people will intentionally use the word ijma' to mean the overwhelming majority. So you see, the word can be used in two ways. It can be used in the strict sense that we've been talking about here, everyone, no difference. And sometimes, accidentally, people will claim that there's no difference. That's a mistake. And sometimes people will intentionally use the word ijma', but they're not meaning it in this strict sense. What they mean is overwhelming majority. Right, so that could be the case, and sometimes that is the case, right? So when somebody makes that claim, and they have the intention that the overwhelming majority, they are not claiming that the ijma' that they're using, the way they're using the word, they're not claiming that it's certain. It's not qat'i. That's the difference, and it's a very important difference. So when someone is claiming that ijma' is 100%, you're claiming that it's 100% certainty. When you're not using ijma' in that sense, and you're using in a loose sense, and you're saying there's ijma' on this, meaning the vast overwhelming majority, you're not claiming to be 100% certain in terms of proof. It's a little bit lower than that. 98%, well, whatever percentage you want to put on it, right? So there's a difference. So that's important, and you find this term being used all the time. What is the benefit of even using the word ijma'? See, there's the two terms, so you don't need to know these terms, but the two terms, ijma' is what we're talking about. There's another term called jumhur, and jumhur means majority. And then there's weird ways you can twist this term. You can put jumhurul jamahir, like the majority of the majority, right? Meaning like overwhelming majority. So the thing is, what is the beauty of using the term ijma' or whatever? What is the point of talking about the overwhelming majority? Is there any point of talking about that? Well, absolutely there is. What's the benefit of having the overwhelming majority of scholars taking one particular position? It creates uniformity in society on certain issues, and that's important. That can be very, very important. And it helps to build unity within society on certain things. So, for example, someone brought up the issue of the moon sighting, thing and all of that. So even though the opinion may not be theoretically the majority on one side, because there's pretty big difference of opinion on the issue, but imagine the scholars in a local area, overwhelming majority took one position, then the Muslims would be united in that area at least. That would be awesome. Of course, it's not happening. Maybe for another decade, 2 decades. Allah knows best, make dua for it. But that's something, right? So that's the beauty of having the overwhelming majority. So it's a good thing. So you find this term being used a lot. So sometimes people will say, there is an ijma' of all the scholars of Iraq on this issue. And when I say Iraq, I'm not talking about modern Iraq. I'm talking about traditional Iraq, right? So they used to say, this is an ijma' of all the scholars in Iraq. What does that mean? You use the word ijma', which is technically meaning every scholar in the whole world. But when you say the ijma' of the scholars of Iraq, you've specified that you're using the word ijma' not in the strict legal sense, but in a loose sense to mean overwhelming majority. Or maybe all in Iraq, but you're not talking about the same thing. So for example, you also find people using this term, there is ijma' among the scholars of the Hanafi school, or ijma' of the scholars among the Maliki school. Right? So but just by saying that, they've qualified their statement and they've shown and proven that they're not using the word scholarly consensus or ijma' in its absolute universal sense. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. Yes. Scholars use this term. Muslim scholars use this term in books. Yes. Yes. I'm going to give you examples. As soon as we get to examples, you'll understand more, inshallah. So, let's move to the examples. So examples are, let's say during the time of the companions. Okay, during the time of the companions, they established scholarly consensus on many issues. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the issues. One of the issues was, the Quran says, in a verse, prohibited to you in marriage are your mothers. Your mothers are prohibited to you, meaning you cannot marry your mom. So then the companions came and expanded this and says, not only are you not allowed to marry your mother, you're not allowed to marry your grandmother as well. And that is prohibited. So now the difference is, if somebody came along, a group of scholars came along and they said, imagine this didn't exist. And all of a sudden, no one ever talked about this. And then in 400 years later, there are scholars there, and there are mujtahids living at that time. If this didn't exist, and all of a sudden 99% of mujtahids came along and said that, you know what, you're not allowed to marry your grandmother. And one of them said, yes, you are, because the text doesn't clearly say that. There would be no scholarly consensus on this issue. Now, does it mean that it's okay for for that person or whatever to marry their grandmother? No, what it means is, when you make the claim, you're not allowed to marry your grandmother, you cannot say that our ruling or our position is qat'i, it's certain, but rather it's zanni, it's probable. That's the difference. Still, you can hold your position very clearly. You say, come on, this is sick, and why would you do something like this? But you can't make the claim that is qat'i. Now you have to change it. But because the companions discussed this issue, and because they clarified it, and there was a question that arose, somebody brought up the question, or they decided to tackle this on a hypothetical level. The issue of whether or not this applies to a grandmother somehow came up. Right? Maybe it came up because they were in Persia. And in Persia, when they were taking over Persia, the Persians were incestuous people. So they would marry their own mothers. They would marry their own sisters, right? And their own brothers and all of that. So they were incestuous people, that's well known, and perhaps that's the reason that got them to discuss this issue. But regardless, not irregardless, but regardless of that, the issue was brought up. And all the companions agreed that the grandmother is prohibited to be married, and therefore they established a scholarly consensus. If anyone else comes along afterwards, no matter how great of a scholar they are, and says, well, I disagree, their disagreement doesn't mean anything. Okay? Another example. The Prophet specified, the question on this? It's both. So in this example, it would be zanni or probable because one person didn't agree and because it was 400 years later. So there was no previous ijma' which was established. Salam. The question is, can anything be qat'i now? Not these old things which have already been discussed, but new things, which I'm going to talk about that. Okay. So, okay, so another example is, the Prophet, peace be upon him, specified that the grandmother is entitled to 1/6 of the share of inheritance. Right, so for those of you who took the previous class on Islamic law, we talked about inheritance, how much grandmother gets, grandfather gets, all of that. So the Prophet specified the grandmother gets 1/6, but that 1/6 ratio is not mentioned in the Quran. And the hadith that talks about the 1/6 is not at the level of mutawatir, or continuous transmission, which means that the hadith is what? It's zanni, right? In terms of its authenticity, it's probable, but it's not certain. But here's the thing. All the companions got together and they unanimously accepted that this is the ruling. So there's scholarly consensus that the grandmother gets 1/6, not out of some random thing. They didn't just make up this number 1/6. It's from a hadith, right? But the hadith is not at the level of mutawatir. So now what happens to this hadith? Automatically gets upgraded from being zanni to qat'i, now it's certain. The other hadith, which Something like this, another hadith, if there was no scholarly consensus, it would not have received the upgrade. But the fact that there's scholarly consensus, boom, it got upgraded, now it's considered certain. Okay? So that's what scholarly consensus has also done. There were many, many other instances where the companions established scholarly consensus. Okay? Yes. We're getting to that. Okay. So there are many other examples. So for example, here's just a small list of them. Simultaneous marriage between a woman and her aunt is forbidden. Right, so we talked about that. But that is not something specifically mentioned in the Quran, but it's been established through scholarly consensus. Nor is it specifically mentioned in hadith or something like that. Actually, no, sorry, it's mentioned in hadith, but it's not specifically mentioned in the Quran. Number 2, a grandson is excluded from the inheritance whenever there's a son present. So the son will override the grandson when it comes to inheritance. Number 3, a half-brother will count as a full brother in inheritance when there is no full brother. So we discussed that in inheritance, full brothers from the mother's side, full brothers from the father's side, or brothers from the mother's side, brothers from the father's side, and full brothers. They all have different rulings. Same thing with sister. Sister from the mother's side, sisters from the father's side, and full sisters. So the thing is, when one of them is absent, one of them will take the place. And this has been scholarly consensus on this. Otherwise, someone could come along and claim and say, oh, well, they don't count as brothers. If you don't have from both parents, it doesn't count as a real, sibling or whatever it is. So there's scholarly consensus on that. Number 4, where did I go? Full brother. Okay, that a grandfather can have guardianship over the person and the property over his grandchild who's a minor. Okay? Just like, so for example, it's clear in Islam, in the hadith and all of that, that the father over his own child has, what's the word I use? Guardianship. That's well known, everyone. You're a guardian of your own child. Over their person, meaning you can make decisions for them, you can, make them go to school, you can make them do whatever it is when they're minors. And over their property as well. So your job is to take care of their property. But it didn't say grandfather anywhere, it just said father. The thing is, grandfather is also there, but not just by analogy, but by scholarly consensus. Right? So it's upgraded. So there's another example. So there are many, many other examples. Some examples in another field is there are many things that the companions did by consensus, but they did it for the good of the community. Right? They weren't trying to establish this as a law. So something like this, what's known as maslaha, mursala, we're going to talk about this in about a week or two. This time, maybe 3 weeks, this thing is for the benefit of the community, and it can change with circumstances. So their consensus in this was to approve that it's okay to do it, but it doesn't mean that it's binding for future generations. So for example, I'll give you some hints for now. Compiling the Quran into book form was something that was agreed upon by all the companions. No one raised up their voice and said, I'm not going to accept you doing this action. The Quran should never be compiled in book form. No one objected to it in the end. Number 2, not distributing the conquered land of Iraq to the soldiers. So when they were conquering the area of Iraq, during one of the periods of time, the companions agreed that they're not going to distribute the land to any of the people who are conquering this land. Even though it was the practice of the Prophet to go and do this in Khaybar, in other places. The reason why they did it was for the benefit of the community. Why? Because the intentions may get messed up. Iraq was a really luxurious place, Persian Empire, a lot of wealth. Now what's going to happen to the generals and the leaders who are leading the army? They're going to think, oh, we can get a lot of good stuff. I would like to attack that area, because of the money. So they stopped that distribution of land to the soldiers and to the generals for a period of time, and that was agreed upon. Another one is adding a second call to the prayer, the azan, to the Friday prayer. So some of you know this, some of you don't. Is that you notice that on Friday prayer, there are 2 calls to prayer. One is right before the khutbah, and one is like 15 minutes before that, or half hour before that, or whatever it is. That first call was not there during the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. It was not there during Abu Bakr's time, or Umar's time. It was actually introduced during Uthman's time. And the reason why it was introduced was because there was a need, because the masjid was becoming, so crowded. There were so many people all over the place. They needed a way to announce to people so that they have enough time to make it. Because if you make the call to prayer right before the sermon, and then people walk and it takes them 5 minutes because they heard it from far away, they're not going to make it in time, they miss part of the sermon. So it was added later on for the benefit of the community. Okay, so we're going to talk more about this in another chapter. So you get the point. So that type of scholarly consensus may not be binding, but there's still consensus that it's okay to do it. That's why it was done. All right. In addition to all of these examples which I've mentioned, there's always been a scholarly consensus or ijma' on things which are clear-cut in Islam, like the 5 pillars of Islam. It's clear scholarly consensus. If anyone comes and says, no, there's not 5 prayers in the day, there are 3 prayers in the day, or there are 2 prayers in the day on a regular basis, on a daily basis, this is a complete violation of ijma' or scholarly consensus. If somebody says that, zakah does not need to be paid because it has some other meaning. The word zakah means blah, 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 went into a dictionary, I came up with a new meaning, and I think it actually means this. This has always had scholarly consensus, so it's clear-cut. Interest being prohibited is clear-cut. It's always been a scholarly consensus on it. Wine and intoxicants being forbidden, always been, clear-cut. Fornication, right? Relationships outside of marriage, clear-cut. Always has scholarly consensus. All those things are clear. You're not supposed to be praying in front of an idol. Clear cut. The example we talked about in the first day of class, the word kuffar, right? In one verse means disbelievers, and in another verse, the word kuffar means what? Farmers. So how do you know which one is which? The fact that this verse means farmers and the other verse means disbelievers, by scholarly consensus, is clear-cut that this one means farmers here, and this one means disbelievers here, and you can't you can't apply one to the other. So that's by scholarly consensus. No one can come along and say, I just discovered this brand new dictionary which explains to me that this was not correct, or I just discovered this archaeological evidence which none of you guys had before, because I'm a professor in some Ivy League college which has $1 billion budget for research, and we discovered these scrolls in this one little remote area outside of Mecca, and these scrolls prove that this word actually had this meaning in the Quran. Not going to happen. There's no basis for that. Okay, so things like that are established through scholarly consensus. What is the basis? That's your question. What is the basis? What is this founded upon? Right? The reality is there are many proofs. In my opinion, the strongest proof is that scholarly consensus is actually self-validated. It's a self-validating concept because Islam is the final religion. And if Islam is the final religion, then there always needs to be a group of people who are going to remain on the truth. Even if it's a tiny little group, there has to be a group of people who are on the true form of Islam somewhere. And actually, this is attested to by several statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him. There are several hadiths which say that there's going to be a group that will always be on the truth. Now, some people have tried to prove that these statements, this is just a side note for you, okay? In case you take a class on Islamic law in a university or something like that, you're bound to encounter this point, right? A lot of people have made the claim that these statements about the Prophet saying that there's going to be a group of people on the truth, Islam is going to remain, the community, this, that. Some people have claimed that this statement of the Prophet is a proof for ijma' because it implies that all the scholars are going to agree on the truth, right? And a lot of people, academics and all of that, have looked at this idea and said, that's a very flimsy argument, because this hadith is not saying that. It's not saying the whole Muslim community is going to be on the truth. Therefore, since ijma', scholarly consensus, is supposed to be every single Muslim scholar, right? Therefore, this hadith is not talking about every single one being on the truth. Therefore, your argument is invalid and it's weak. But if you flip it and you understand ijma' in its correct way, if the Prophet is saying that there's going to be some group on the truth, no matter how small they are, automatically they will speak up and violate any type of ijma' from ever forming. So these statements of the Prophet actually do prove ijma', but not in the way that some people explain it. But if you understand it in the other way, different understanding, inverse understanding of this, it makes sense. If you didn't get that, don't worry about it. If you got it, start debating professors in universities on this point, because this has become a very heated topic in Western institutions. The righteous group? So there's the question. What if they're not scholars, right? How could you have a righteous group without knowledge? Right? So it's automatically implied that there's got to be some level of knowledge in this group. Because Islam cannot exist without proper knowledge. You can't practice what's right if you don't have knowledge of what's right. So it's already implied in there as well. Okay. So this small group would speak up and they would be adhering to the truth. No matter how small they would hold a contrary view. It would break scholarly consensus, so it couldn't exist. So there's proof for it. There's also several verses of the Quran which hint at the validity of scholarly consensus as a proof. One of those verses I'll just give is, O you who believe, obey Allah and obey the Messenger, and those from among you who are invested with authority, or vested with authority. So this is the verse. What the verse is saying, O you who believe, meaning all believers, listen up. This is a general rule, you all need to know this. Obey Allah, clear cut. Obey the Messenger, clear cut. Obey the people from among you who are vested with authority. So you are responsible for obeying Allah, for obeying the Messenger, and obeying the people who've been placed in authority over you. Right? So what does that mean? So scholars have looked at this verse and said, well, authority can mean either authority in terms of political authority in secular affairs, but Ibn Abbas and some other scholars said it also applies to religious authority. So in the worldly field, if the leader tells you, we're marching out in this area, and you're a soldier and you say, well, you know what, I think that we should march in this area. The leader says, no, I'm the general of the army, we're marching in this area. He says, no, I don't agree with you, I'm going to go the other way. This verse is telling that soldier that, look, this person is in charge of you. If they're not ordering you to do something against Islam, they're not telling you to go and kill little children, they're not telling you to go and do whatever else, that's wrong, then your responsibility, according to the Quran, is to obey that leader. That creates stability in society. But Ibn Abbas and other scholars are also saying, not only is it saying that, but that's in non-religious affairs. In religious affairs, there are also people who are placed in authority over you, and those are the people who are scholars in the community. Everyone recognizes them as being legitimate scholars, except maybe few, sideline people or whatever it is. So now your responsibility is to obey these people as well. So when they tell you something, you should be following it. So this is a hint at the idea of ijma'. So it refers to secular as well as religious leaders, and it makes scholarly consensus have a basis. So what about the conditions? What are the conditions for scholarly consensus to actually exist? All right. So we talked about a little bit about the definition. We said in one era. We said every, across the board. We said they have to be mujtahids, right? They have to be expert scholars, etc., etc. So what are the conditions? Well, the way that ijma' or scholarly consensus has been defined so far is extremely difficult to prove if you try to prove it literally. Because hypothetically, this would require each and every single mujtahid or expert scholar to clearly manifest their opinion on an issue, either verbally or in writing. So every single one has to have said Like for example, the companions. During the companions' time, right? If you take this strict definition and you say, look, every single person has to have a ruling on this, a verdict on this. So you cannot marry your grandmother. Okay. Ibn Abbas, he made a statement. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he made a statement. Abdullah ibn Umar, he made a statement. Aisha made a statement. Right? And you say, well, wait a minute. What about Zayd ibn Thabit? He's also considered to be a scholar. Did he make a statement? He said, I mean, no one heard him, but he's not disagreeing. No. If he didn't make a statement in verbally or in writing, then there's no real ijma'. So if you look at it from a strict perspective, so this is something that's been debated, right? Say, well, there's no proof. Maybe he was hiding his opinion, right? Maybe he never, the question never reached him. You know, everyone was discussing it. He was tending to his sheep outside. He didn't know about it. So what do you do in that case? So that's very, very difficult to prove if you're going to define ijma' in this way. Even though many scholars define it in this way. It's very, very difficult in reality to prove. But if we look at it from another perspective and we say if there's an implicit scholarly consensus, okay? And implicit scholarly consensus is known as this is known as ijma' as-sukuti. Sukut means silence. So meaning implicit meaning you don't have to speak, right? But it's implied that you agreed with this ruling, so you don't have to always say something. So there's debate on whether or not this is binding or not. But anyways, understand implicit scholarly consensus is a lot more practical. It has the assumption that, look, if there was any scholar who is an expert and is living wherever, and it's a very, very important issue. It's an issue that everyone is talking about because every single person is basically, manifesting an opinion on this. Then the issue is likely to have reached him. Very, very likely that he heard about it, right? Or at least he thought about it. And if he differed, he would have expressed his opinion, right? Unless there's proof to show that he was silent for a certain reason. Like somebody had a gun to his head. Right? If you can prove that, he was being quiet. Now you can't imagine, you say, okay, the same example I just gave you. Can't marry your grandmother. Zayd ibn Thabit. Right? It's not likely, right, that he differed with this opinion. Let's just assume he didn't make a statement. Everyone else made a statement, he didn't make a statement. You don't find any statement from him. And it's not likely that he's going to disagree. If he was going to disagree, he probably would have said something. Right? And you can say, well, what if he was forced to be quiet? Who's forcing him to be quiet? Why would he even, disagree with it? There's no indication at all. Therefore, it's okay to assume implicitly that he agrees. He doesn't need to say it. So that's this type of ijma'. He would have spoken up, right? Now, so as long as there's no reason to believe that there's some kind of backlash or whatever it is, right? And this can happen. It can very well happen. Those of you who study Islamic history, imagine you're a scholar living at the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. And he's asking you a question. You say, well, why don't I answer this question after, this guy leaves our city, and then I'll go ahead and answer this question. And he doesn't express an opinion. You say, well, see, he was quiet, therefore everyone agreed. Does anyone disagree the fact that I'm going to start drinking wine? Anyone disagree? No scholars disagreeing? Okay, great. That's ijma' sukuti. That's an implied consensus. It's okay that I drink. Obviously, in that case, when you realize there are circumstances like that, you have to take that into consideration. All right. So among the conditions that are generally agreed upon, okay, in order to form a scholarly consensus, the scholars not only should be expert scholars, they need to be upright, okay, in their religious character. Which means what? Imagine, there's a scholar, he studied everything, master of Arabic, master of Quran, master of Sunnah, master of everything, and then the guy doesn't pray. Right? Or he skips Fajr prayer. Or he drinks. Or he has 5 wives. right, against Islam, or whatever other reason that he is not of an upright character, then he doesn't count as being involved in, even though technically he's qualified, he's disqualified because of this reason. Also, these scholars need to be clear of innovation and clear of heresy. So they should not be holding any deviant beliefs, and they should not be having any innovations, which means innovations in the religion was called bid'ah, right, which is prohibited in Islam. So they should not be having any of these things. So what does that mean? That means that this actually would exclude certain groups that we kind of hinted at in the Islamic beliefs. We talked about them in the Islamic beliefs class, so I'm not going to go into the details too much. But just to give an example, the Kharijites, the Khawarij, would be excluded. So if you say, well, there were some really great scholars among the Khawarij and they didn't agree with this, well, they're not taken into consideration. Well, why not? They're Muslim. Yes, they're Muslim, that's true. But they're considered to be a deviant group, or a group that practices innovation. Therefore, their scholars are not considered when we're talking about scholarly consensus. And the same thing with the Rawafid Shia. Okay, and we talked about different groups and different types of Shia. This is a specific type of Shia who have a little bit, higher level of deviancy or innovation. Therefore, they're also excluded. Okay, so it's important to keep that in mind. So if somebody says, well, why don't you take all the scholars into consideration? Are you saying they're not Muslim? I say, no, we're not saying that they're not Muslim. But they either may be innovators or they may be have heretical beliefs, which excludes them from being considered in this doctrine or this idea of ijma or scholarly consensus. Now, getting to the hypothetical thing. It's actually been debated whether scholarly consensus has ever been really achieved in reality after the companions. So the companions we talked about a little bit. After the companions, has there ever really been any scholarly consensus? Because the companions we can understand. So this is an issue that's been debated by scholars. Some say yes, some say no. Some people have actually debated whether scholarly consensus, according to this definition, has ever existed even amongst the companions. Right? So the thing is this, when the companions were being consulted, right, let's say they were being consulted on zakah, or they were being consulted on the issue of compiling the Quran, and you say there's a scholarly consensus on it's okay to compile the Quran. Okay, when they were deciding that, where were all the Muslim scholars? Were they all in the city of Medina being consulted on this one issue? No. Some of them were off in a battlefield over here, off in a battlefield over there, off for a errand of delivering a message to somebody else. These were not ivory tower scholars. Right? The companions, and I don't mean that in a negative way. People who are researchers are researchers. You got to sit in the university and you got to research all day. But from that perspective, these were not people who were just sitting there and just working on things. They were very, very qualified companions, and they were all over the place, right? They were moving around, they were doing so many things. They were not just sitting in the city of Medina. So, in that case, is there any proof to show that when one of these issues arose, the Khalifa would call all of them back, or send a letter to all of them and wait for all the letters with the answers to come back before they would make a decision? No. There's no proof to show that. Which means what? In reality, even the scholarly consensus during the time of the companions was a consensus of the people who were present, who were around, who had access, who happened to be in the area, and they all agreed. Right? But obviously this got out and it started spreading, and the whole community eventually started knowing about it. So there is an implicit scholarly consensus, because if any of those in a distant land found out that the companions in Medina agreed on something and they disagreed, what would they have done? Well, they would have said something. Right? They would have said something. They would have spoken up. So in that case, there is implicit consensus among the companions, but not explicit consensus. Okay. And obviously another reason why people discuss whether consensus has existed or can exist, can it even exist now, one of the problems is that the criteria of being a mujtahid is relative. Right? It's not 100% clearly defined. Right? So what exactly do you need to know in order to be considered as a mujtahid? It's relative. So potentially, can scholarly consensus exist today on anything? There's a potential. It's going to be very, very rare, but there's a potential. Like, for example, in vitro fertilization is a new issue. Never been tackled before by scholars in the past. Right? Can there exist a consensus among expert scholars, assuming that there are mujtahids or half mujtahids or whatever it is? There could be. Right? Is there per se? It's hard to say. On in vitro fertilization, I don't think there is. An electronic signature, counting as a real signature. Right? I think that one should have a scholarly consensus. Right? If it doesn't, then I think there's some issue with the scholar in the sense that they're not understanding the reality of electronic, devices and transactions and all of that. When you do an e-signature, it represents your signatures. It's agreed upon by scholars that signature represents your consent. And we're going to talk more about that later on, but in analogy in the next chapter. But does an electronic signature actually represent your signature? Well, in the right circumstances, yes. It should. It should. So there probably could be a consensus on something like this. But now someone comes along, some random person who's not a scholar, and says, you know what? CIS, they made me sign, an electronic document that says I watched the, what was it called? Was it orientation? Yeah, that I watched the orientation and I read the student book and I'm going to be held accountable for it. And then they typed their name and they clicked OK and everything. And all of a sudden, say, well, I don't think that applies that's not like a real signature, That's not my real agreement. I was just typing my name, that doesn't mean anything. I didn't read that agreement or whatever it was, You say, you know what, your opinion is, it's not taken into consideration. This counts, even Islamically. So I have no Islamic obligation to you. Just because I type my name doesn't mean that I agree. Well, if you signed your name, would you agree? Say, yeah, but electronic, I don't approve of it. Obviously that's not gonna fly. Hopefully all of you have signed that agreement. Who has signed the agreement? MashaAllah, pretty good, pretty good. All right, so okay, so the reality, in my opinion, is that scholarly consensus is not this explicit agreement of each and every single one. It's this general agreement of all scholars, kind of like an implicit agreement, such that it's felt that none of the other scholars would have likely objected to it. And that's pretty much what scholarly consensus is. So obviously, why is this likely? It's likely because Islam is the final religion. And if Islam is the final religion, it must be preserved. At least its essentials need to be preserved intact. And therefore, scholarly consensus helps to preserve the religion of Islam, to make sure that no generation is going to come and mess it up, just like many or all the other religions have been messed up along the centuries and years and all of that. So that's consensus. Should we take a break or should we continue? No opinion. There's no consensus here, obviously. All right, so we'll continue, inshallah. Analogy. So now moving on to the fourth method, which is known as qiyas or analogy. The fourth method for establishing a rule is to apply a type of analogy. Now look, what is an analogy in English language? What does the word analogy actually mean? It means that you compare one thing with another thing because there's a similarity between the two of them. People use analogies all the time in their daily life and all of that. Right? So we use analogies in everyday speech and everything. Say like, this, I can't think of a good one, but I'm sure there's many analogies that can be made. But in Islamic law, what is an analogy? In Islamic law, an analogy is specifically this, is to extend the ruling on one issue or one case. I changed this word to case. So if you want to use the word case instead of issue, I changed the text. So just so that you know, we'll use the word case. So to extend the ruling from one case, which has specifically been mentioned in the Quran or in the Sunnah, to another case which has not been mentioned in the Quran or the Sunnah, because of the commonality between the two things. So let me give you an example and it'll make clear sense. Examples are the best way to understand. So for example, wine, khamr, is expressly prohibited in the Quran and is clear cut. And the word that's used is khamr, which means wine. Right? So now the reason that wine is prohibited is pretty obvious, and that is the fact that wine can intoxicate you. You get into the state and you get all messed up and you start, beating up your family, you start getting, into car accidents and everything. So obviously it's prohibited. You can't control yourself. Now, if there's another drink which has the ability to intoxicate in a similar way that wine has the ability, like vodka for example, then vodka is also going to be prohibited by analogy because it has the same thing. But if somebody says, hey, no, I don't agree with that, man. Vodka's fine, because do you see in the Quran? Does the Quran say vodka's not allowed? No, it doesn't. So therefore, I can drink vodka. It says wine is not allowed. It didn't say beer and vodka and brandy and whiskey and all these things are not allowed. So I just drink those. But trust me, I'm a good Muslim. I never drink wine. I just drink the other stuff. Ferment, there's different, many linguistic meanings, but generally it means, in the Quranic context, it generally means wine. There's probably some difference of opinion, but anyways. So the thing is, and in the hadith, it clarifies there's another basis that anything that's fermented can be considered to be a wine. But linguistically it means wine. So, where was I? So wine is expressly prohibited, therefore vodka should be expressly prohibited. Now look, the reality is you think that, okay, this is obvious. This is literally like so obvious. Okay? I've been approached several times with arguments like this. Right? I'm telling you, say, well, the Quran doesn't mention beer, and you have to understand, wine is made from grapes, right? And beer is made from barley. Not only is wine made from, what is grape is a fruit, right? So anything made from fruits, I completely stay away from. But barley is different. Barley it's not even a fruit, right? So it's a grain. So we're not talking about the same thing here. So I only drink beer. Trust me, I'm a good Muslim. I will never in my life touch wine. I hate wine. I'm like, mashallah, you expect me to, be happy about that. So this is an argument that's made. And one of the most common arguments among Muslim youth today is weed. That's it. But the Quran doesn't prohibit weed. And the Sunnah doesn't prohibit weed. So why can't I smoke weed, man? What's wrong with marijuana? I can't smoke a little bit? Or what? Okay, what if you don't like the smoking? I'm going to put it in my cereal and call it Wheaties, and I'm going to eat it. They actually sell this in Amsterdam, unfortunately. I actually went into a shop one day, and they're selling cereal, and it's called Wheaties. Weedies. Right, so, yeah, and maybe now cholera, all these places. So anyways, so this can be a serious problem, not among probably serious people, but it's still an issue. And sometimes people don't know how to answer. I get this question from friends. How do I answer them? He's got a good point. The beer is from barley, and it's not mentioned in the Quran, so it's different. He said, look, you got to understand this basic stuff. So anyways, so you're getting the point now. So that's through analogy. So prohibition of vodka does not fall within the language of the text. It's not specifically mentioned. But you can extend the prohibition on wine to vodka because of the underlying reason, which is intoxication. Likewise, another example is the Quran prohibits buying and selling while the Friday prayer is being performed. It says it's a verse in the Quran clearly. It says you're not allowed to buy and sell. Leave off trade. Right? And what's the reason behind it? The reason behind it obviously is distracting you away from being in the prayer. So you're not allowed to be buying and selling. And some scholars even said those transactions which take place are invalid. You need to go and return the product. It doesn't even count. Right? So this distracts people away from attending the prayer. So by analogy, right, let's say somebody says, well, the Quran clearly says you can't buy and sell. But I'm not buying or selling. I'm getting a loan because I need a loan right now. So I'm just negotiating a loan at the moment. Quran is not talking about that. So is it prohibited to get a loan or to give a loan or to get a loan while the Friday prayer is being performed? Yes. But where? Does it say in the Quran? No. Does it say in the Sunnah? No. By analogy. Right? Because it's the same exact cause. What if someone says, I'm just renting. I'm signing a rental agreement, a lease agreement right now. I'm not buying or selling. This is a rental agreement. It's a different contract. Those of you who study Islamic law too, buying and selling and rental contracts are two different contracts, right? You say, well, I'm doing this. What if you say, oh, I'm doing a collateral contract, right? We studied collateral. It's a different contract. You say, no, well, in that case, the Quran doesn't prohibit that. Or even if you take it outside of economic transactions. These are all economic transactions. Can you apply analogy to other things? Like say, for example, I'm getting married right now, so I can't make it for the prayer. So do I leave or do I not leave? Does it apply? Can you prohibit getting married during the Friday prayer outside of the masjid, obviously, because you're going to be missing the Friday prayer? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But what if you say, I don't want to keep going with this, but what if you say, going to the bathroom is not allowed? And then you got a problem. You got a big problem. Right? Going to the bathroom is an exception because obviously if you don't go to the bathroom, it's going to distract you away from the prayer more than if you go to the bathroom. And there's exceptions to the rule, right? And of course the main issue comes up for students. What if I have a class during Jummah prayer? Do I miss my class? Right? Or do I go to the Jummah, do I miss my class or I skip the Jummah prayer? And my parents are going to be upset with me, and my professor, he's kind of racist, he doesn't like Islam, and he's Islamophobe, and this and that. My grade's going to go down. If I don't get this, then I'm not going to graduate. If I don't graduate, I'm not going to get a job. If I don't get a job, I'm not going to get married. If I don't get married, I'm going to commit zina and fall into adultery, and therefore, you know what, there's just absolute necessity that I have to go to class. So anyways, we covered that in Islamic Law 1. But you see the reasoning that can be put here. So what is the basis for analogy? Is there proof? There are several proofs for analogy. The first basis, and I think the strongest basis, is just from reason. It just makes common sense. So look, if you assume, and you can assume rightfully, every single law in Islam is prescribed with some objective in mind. It has to have some objective in mind. It's not just Allah made these haphazard laws randomly. There's no purpose. You know what? When you're praying, you stand on one foot. All right? And you just stand on one foot. Well, why? I felt like telling you to stand on one foot. There's a reason for everything in Islam. Okay? Sometimes we know what it is, sometimes we don't know what it is, but here, there's a purpose. There is some purpose in mind. It's not haphazard. So what does that mean? It means that there's an underlying reason behind every law. And if there's an underlying reason behind the law, right, then it should not be restricted to one scenario only, right? Because that wouldn't make any sense. So for example, because the same objectives, right? So it wouldn't make any sense to say that, you know what, wine is prohibited, but vodka is allowed, and martinis are allowed, and whiskey is allowed, and beer is allowed, and every other type of intoxicant is allowed, but only wine is not allowed. And the reason why wine is prohibited, and there's so many other proofs for it, the reason you specify, wine is prohibited because it causes intoxication. That's clear cut. And then you say, but all these other things which cause intoxication are allowed. That wouldn't make any sense at all. Right? That would mean that there's no objective behind any of these laws. But there are objectives, right? So therefore, sense tells us that analogy has to be applied. Same thing. If somebody said that there's a solid intoxicant, there's this brand new type of substance, which is solid wine. Right? It's like wine in food form. And you just eat this little bar and you get drunk, exactly the same flavor, same effect on your body, same type of intoxication. And you say, well, only the liquid wine is forbidden, not the solid wine. Right? Would that make any sense? It wouldn't, because the liquid is solid. If the purpose is intoxication, the purpose is being fulfilled, so it wouldn't make any sense. So therefore, by reason, analogy has to apply. Okay? Another reason, which is rational, is that in reality, people are going to encounter so many different circumstances in their life, right? You're not going to encounter exactly the same circumstances. So when the Quran or the Sunnah mentions a law about a specific circumstance, and then you come across a new circumstance, if you can't apply any analogy, then you're not going to have any guidance for your life. So if it's only limited to that specific instance, then the Quran and Islam would not be a comprehensive guide for life, and it would not really help you in life at all, if it's only restricted to those things. Now keep in mind, when we're talking about analogy, we're not talking about making new laws or new rules. Actually, what we're doing is we're applying the same principles or the same objectives from some issues onto other issues when it's clear-cut and you're allowed to do so. Okay? So that's analogy. Should we keep going? Or should we take a break? Take a break now? We need to digest it, right? It's a heavy subject, but it's gonna change the way you look at Islam. Guarantee you it's gonna change the way you look at Islam. Alright, so what I need before you go on the break, 8:52, we're gonna come back at 9:02. I'm looking for some volunteers for CIS. We are way overloaded with our workload, and we need some volunteers. But the volunteers we're looking for is someone who can dedicate a minimum of 5 hours a week for the entire quarter, or more. Starting immediately, starting immediately. Okay? So if anyone can do that, I mean, some of the work can be from home, but some of the work has to be here. You get to sit in the office and or do some work during class, or whatever, outside of class and all that, whatever it is. So if there's anybody who can volunteer and they're ready to we only need dedicated volunteers though. If you can dedicate yourself to do that, and you're somewhat decent with technology, meaning you know how to go to websites and you know how to you go on YouTube and stuff like that, please see me during the break, okay? Jazakumullah khair. We'll take a break, come back at 9:02. Assalamu alaikum. It can be after that, yeah. But you have the hours for it? Every 5 hours a week you have? Okay, let me. You're in IT, great. It's not only IT, but this is gonna help. Let me. Just write your info down. Name, phone, email address.
There's Girl Scout cookies in the back if anybody wants. Depending on, basically, is it something that I could sit here and do? I have kids who sleep right here 2, 4, 6, 8 hours a week.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Since you're already here. Yeah, absolutely. Just I already have your email. I'm gonna write your name down, inshallah.
I had a question. I was wondering if some type of obligation to help out in Syria, like people in Syria, or have any obligation to them?
Of course. Anyone who's being oppressed, we have an obligation to help them in whatever capacity we can. Right? Everyone has different capacity and capability. But yeah, we have a responsibility.
Someone has to go fly over there and help anybody in charge.
Not necessarily. There are different ways of helping. That may not be the most effective way. So there's many ways to help. One way is to help the people who need food, help the people who need medicine. Another way to help is from right here, because lobbying, writing articles, convincing politicians to vote and take a stance. Right? All of this is going to make a difference on a worldwide level. Going in, let's say, convincing the Russians somehow. Let's say, imagine you have some Russian connections, right? Convincing the Russians to stop supporting this government, because one of the reasons H, LH or KH that you put an L. No problem. Yeah. So I'll leave 006. Is 007? Yeah. Okay. I was gonna say, man. I was gonna say,
You're
man.
missing one.
All right, Jazakumullah khair. All right.
If I do my what I can,
You do what? Yeah.
my application.
Yeah, absolutely. Do as much as you can.
So, can I ask you one question? Hassan Nasrallah, would you be considered a very bad man? Hassan Nasrallah.
Who's that?
He's the leader of football.
Oh, okay. I thought so. I mean, right now their stance is problematic because what they're doing. I don't know the details to be honest with you.
But like, just as a leader in the Shia religion, he like,
What he's doing right now and killing the people and all that.
no, just religiously, like he makes innovations in religion, and
Yeah, I mean, it's problematic, obviously.
he's considered like a very bad man, right?
I mean, bad is relative, but I mean, there's problems in his beliefs. It needs to be fixed.
Okay.
No. I can't have hot chocolate. Do you have tea? Do they have tea? Green tea.
You mentioned times.
Once it gets to the level where it can be intoxicated, if it doesn't get to that level, then you go ahead. Probably two summarizing, I think, summarizing this way way better. Less words, like that. Establishing that's a good point. Next one. Prescribe for objectives.
Well, right now, taking that analogy right now. It's like
Yeah, because one person is locked out, so.
Sometimes we can and I was thinking if we can like organize an event and like as an social because we didn't advertise, we didn't ask the what you appeal.
How big is
So not big, just like 10 people, 12 people.
too much for me to drive? If you do a really big event
Yeah.
with like 100 people, I'll do it.
100 people.
Yeah. Because this is such a
That's
big
very
event.
important issue to discuss with the
I know, that's exactly why I'd rather drive out for a big event. It needs to be
I will
discussed.
see if they want to like make it as a big event because it's for the youth group, for the girls youth group, and the family they want somebody to discuss with the boys that have issue.
Because
And
for,
I don't know anybody like guy that they could. You know anybody?
I don't, I can recommend one person, Osman Omar.
Oh, he can come over there.
It depends on his state. He's in the same boat as me. We're both overloaded. So you actually, we don't public speak really so much. I'm trying to stop public speaking.
Yeah, but I think about this issue.
No, that's why I'll just do it on a big forum. Otherwise, if I get invited here and speak to them, if another person finds out, then they're going to say, speak to our youth. Another one's going to speak to our youth. I'm going to be stuck. Have all of them coordinate everything. Get one big giant group together, and then we can do one time.
Okay, I will see what the board will say.
Inshallah.
See if they want to agree.
Ask them. Malik works there, right? Malik Mendelham, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So ask him if he can get 100 people organized.
Okay.
Inshallah.
Two questions for you. How is our video man doing?
Yes, I'm going to answer that right now.
And then, did you find a volunteer? My suggestion was, why don't
We got 3.
you pay them like $10 an hour?
Not right now. If they do a good job, we will.
If they do good, pay them $10. That's the motivation.
Inshallah. Okay, let's continue.
So to remind you about the current discussing
I didn't mean in class. I mean, but we'll outside of that we'll discuss. Inshallah. Okay, so about to resume. Update on Brother Azizan. For those of you who don't know Brother Azizan Khamis, he was the video guy who, mashallah, was filming for an entire year. Not just filming, you saw him filming. You didn't see him editing the videos and doing all the other stuff. So he was in the hospital He had some heart problems. He just had double bypass surgery. So alhamdulillah, he's recovering very, very well. But this is a huge reminder for everybody, including myself. This is a guy who used to bicycle at minimum of 100 miles every week. And he still had, subhanAllah, there was a cholesterol issue and all that. And it's not genetic. It's due to eating. So it's a big, big reminder for all of us. So if you already ate the Girl Scout cookies, that's fine. But now, just be a little bit more careful. Inshallah. Moderation, in moderation, inshallah. In moderation. So just be careful, inshallah. Okay, so continuing. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. So that's the rational basis for qiyas or analogy. From the Quran also hints at the necessity of analogy in many places. Here's one example. The Quran says in the verse, if you disagree over anything, then refer it back to Allah and the Messenger. So this is obviously, when the Prophet was alive, his followers were listening to this. If you ever have any disagreement amongst yourself, you don't know what to do, who do you go to? Go back to Allah and His Messenger, and they're going to give you the answer. Now the thing is, they could, during his lifetime, they could directly go to him. After he was gone, how do you go back to the Messenger of Allah? That's one thing. The second thing is, it didn't say go to the Messenger only. It says go to Allah and His Messenger. So how do you go to Allah, right? To ask Him, you can't ask Allah a question. So how do you do that exactly? So the thing is, it shows clearly that the verse is not only talking about you going back and talking to the Prophet, but it means that if there's ever any issue, you refer it back to Allah, meaning you refer it back to the Quran. You refer it back to the Messenger, meaning you refer it back to the Sunnah. And once the Prophet is gone, how do you refer something back to him? You indirectly refer something back to him by referring it to the Quran and Sunnah. But why would anyone disagree about something if it's already in the Quran and Sunnah? That's why when you disagree about something, it's going to be something that's not explicitly stated. Can I drink vodka? Can I smoke marijuana? Let's say there's a disagreement, because it's not clear-cut in here. You take it back to Allah and His Messenger, meaning you take it back to the Quran and Sunnah, and the only way you can do that is by applying analogy. So that's exactly where analogy fits in, and there's that's a proof from the Quran. Another proof from the Quran is that the Quran actually uses the method of analogy in order to teach lessons, in real life. So for example, Allah says in the Quran, after the story of Surah Yusuf, of Prophet Yusuf, He says, there was certainly in their stories a lesson for those of understanding. Right. After every prophet, he's talking about the prophets, talking about previous nations who passed away or whatever. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? He says, there's a lesson in this for you. Now the thing is, in reality, is anybody going to encounter the exact same scenarios, let's say that Prophet Yusuf encountered? Say Prophet Yusuf went to jail for X number of years, encountered two prisoners, they both had dreams, right? And then they consulted him for the dreams and he interpreted their dreams. And you say, okay, that's an example, that's a lesson, there's a lesson for you in that story. And you say, well, if you don't apply analogy, where's the lesson? The lesson will only happen if that same scenario happens to you. In Egypt, right? And in Egypt, it's easy to go to prison actually. So that part can work, quite well. But the part that doesn't work is, the other part about the two prisoners coming to you and all of that stuff. Because you're probably in solitary confinement or being tortured in Egypt or something like that, right? So, may Allah protect Egypt and its people. Remove the tyrants and the dictators from their power. So this is the thing. So we have to understand this. So Allah used analogy as a way to teach lessons. And the only way you can learn a lesson from these things is to use an analogy. So if I'm in a similar difficult situation, I'm not in prison, but I'm being detained at the airport for questioning because of the fact that I'm a Muslim. That's sufficient reason to detain you today, right? So you're being detained, now you think, okay, how did Prophet Yusuf deal with this situation? Now you can learn a lesson through analogy. even though you're not in exactly the same situation. So obviously, the fact that Allah uses analogy to teach lessons in the Quran means that the idea of analogy should be applicable also in law and should not be closed off that you can't, apply analogy. Proof from the Sunnah regarding analogy. Now the Prophet used to train his companions to actually use analogies in order to understand things. Not only regular things, there's so many examples. But even in Islamic law, particularly with regards to rules of law, he tried to train them with analogies. So here's an example. Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, he came to the Prophet really concerned. He was like, I'm ruined. This is I've done something so bad. So he goes to the Prophet, and the Prophet, okay, well, what's going on? So he says, I've committed, like the worst sin, because I was fasting and I kissed my wife. And he's really like just in a messed up state. So the Prophet could have just told him, look man, it's not haram. It's simple. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with doing that. He could have said that, but he didn't. What did he say instead? He said, Omar, what do you think would be the situation? Like, would you be all stressed out if you rinsed your mouth with water while you were fasting? He said, no, there's nothing wrong with that. So then, instead of saying, there's nothing wrong with this, he said, then what's the problem? So he said, what's the problem? Right? He's giving him an analogy, letting him learn to make an analogy without even giving the final answer. That's all his final statement was, what's the problem? Right? Fafima, right? What's the issue? Right? Meaning, what's the issue with kissing your wife? If you got that point, if it's okay to rinse your mouth with water, what's the problem with kissing your wife while you're fasting? That's not the problem. That's not going to break your fast. Alright, so he taught them analogy. Alright, the companions themselves, they used to use analogies when they didn't have access to the Prophet. And we saw many examples of that, right? So we saw the example of Ammar ibn Yasir doing what in the desert? Rolling around like an animal, like he said, right? So the thing is, when he came to the Prophet said, look, he criticized him in the sense that you didn't need to do that. There was no need for you to do that. But did he ever criticize any of the companions for applying the analogy in the first place, where he said, don't ever try to apply analogy? Never. So he approved their attempt to apply analogies, but sometimes they got it right, sometimes they got it wrong. He critiqued them when they were wrong, and he approved them when they were right. Right? So that's the process itself is fine, and there's a lot of proof for that. So how does analogy exactly work? Well, there are components. There are certain components used in an analogy. There are four main components that need to be identified clearly. So the first thing is there's the original case, okay, which is known as the asl, right? The original case. So for example, this is the instance of the original law that's mentioned in the Quran or the Sunnah, right? So for example, drinking wine is the original case. It's mentioned explicitly in the Quran and in the Sunnah, right? So this is the asl. Then you have the new case that you're trying to decide upon. This is known as the fara'. Okay, the branch, literally, linguistically the branch. The new case is the fara', which means this is the issue which is not mentioned in the Islamic text, and you would like to have a ruling for it, like marijuana or vodka or something like that. Then there's a third component, it's known as the effective cause, or the illah. Okay, and this is one of the most important aspects of analogy or qiyas. This refers to the specific characteristic of similarity between the original case and the new case, such that they should have the same ruling. Right? So what is it in wine that will also exist in vodka that will cause this analogy to be a correct analogy? Otherwise it can be an incorrect analogy. Right? If you say, well, you know what? I'm going to give you examples of incorrect analogies. So what is it there? There has to be something there that's known as the illah, or the effective cause. And the fourth thing is the rule, or the ruling, the hukm, which means that, what is it? Is it obligatory that you drink wine? Is it prohibited? Is it recommended? Is it disliked? Is it allowed? What status does it have? So obviously in this case, wine is prohibited. So here's an example. Is there a table here in the notes? Yes, okay, so here's a table. So So here's, let's take an example. Okay, original case, drinking wine. The new case, the far' is snorting cocaine. Let's take an example of snorting cocaine. The effective cause is causing intoxication. Okay, causing intoxication. And the rule is that it's prohibited. So what happens is, since the original case was prohibited due to the effective cause or the illah being causing intoxication, the new case also has the same effective cause, therefore it has the same ruling which is prohibited. You need to identify 4 things, okay? So these are the 4 components. The next example is the buying and selling during Friday prayer. So we talked about that. Same thing with, let's say, performing a marriage during Friday prayer. You want to decide, can I perform a marriage while a Friday prayer is taking place? You say, well, it does not mention in the Quran. What is the effective cause? Buying and selling during Friday prayer is a type of transaction which prevents a person from attending the Friday sermon or attending the Friday prayer. And that's why it's prohibited, and it falls into the same, the far' has the same problem, therefore it's also prohibited. Very simple, not difficult to, figure out this analogy, right? Now there are other conditions for an analogy to apply. These are not the only, you don't just stop here and say, oh, well, I learned the 4 things, it's easy. Piece of cake, I can start making analogies all over the place. No, there are certain conditions. So here's the conditions. Condition number 1, this is just for an analogy to apply. Number 1, the original case, or the asl, and the ruling, the hukum, must be from a text of the Quran or the Sunnah. Right? So what if someone comes along and says, well, I heard a scholar in the masjid that they were saying that this is not allowed. They say, well, by analogy, I'm going to also say that this other thing is not allowed. If that was not based on a text of the Quran or Sunnah, it's not going to apply. Okay? Number 1. Number 2, the original case, or the asl, must have an effective cause. Number 1, it has to have an effective cause, an illah. And it must be possible to correctly identify exactly what it is. You have to be able to identify what the effective cause is. Right? So what is the effective cause of drinking wine? Intoxication, illah. Right? That's why wine is prohibited. Right? What is the effective cause of not eating pork? Yeah, we're not allowed to eat pork, right? We're not allowed to eat pig, right? What is the illah? What is the effective cause? Okay, I heard that part, but is there an effective cause? Allah said in the Quran, is there an illah that we can identify? It's what? It's fattening. Very good. Very good. Okay, it's fattening. Anyone else have another? It has worms. Very good. Another one. It's filthy. It's filthy. What else? The pig does not have an immune system?
Therefore, if the pig bleeds,
I didn't know that.
that's why that's one of the main reasons why it
doesn't have an immune system. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Anyone heard anything else? One, I heard that it doesn't have a neck, so you can't slaughter it. Have you heard? Anyone heard that? I got an email about that. Yeah, it's an email, right? Okay, now we have 5 potential effective causes, 5 potential illahs, right? The first one was, what was the first one? It's fattening. It's fattening. So by analogy, if pig is prohibited because it's fattening, what is corn oil going to be, right? What are French fries going to fall into, right? What about, think of the Cheesecake Factory, or what's the most fattening food you can, think of nihari, right? Think of nihari's it's like boiling in fat, right? Something like that. So if we say that the pig is fattening, all of a sudden you do an experiment. You have one person eat nihari for 1 week, and you have one person eat pork for a week, and you find out that nihari is actually more fattening than the pig, then nihari has to be prohibited by analogy. Therefore, obviously we're not going to say that, right? I mean, the desis will kill us if we prohibit nihari for them, right? But that's not the point. So it cannot be The illah or the effective cause cannot be that it's fattening. So let's move to number 2. It has worms. Okay. Are there any other animals that have worms? Dogs. What else? There are almost all animals have, especially if you remember last class we talked about it, carnivorous animals in particular have the worms, right? So therefore, well, carnivorous animals are forbidden, but what about non-carnivorous animals? And one of them happens to have worms. So will that be forbidden by analogy? It would be, but we can't just do that, right? So the effective cause or the illah of eating pork is not that it has worms. Number 3. What was number 3? Filth. It's filthy, right? What about chicken? I mean, let's think of something really filthy. No, chicken is it's not that filthy. Dogs, a rat, catfish. Okay, imagine there's another really filthy. Imagine you take a cow and somehow you make it really filthy or something like that. Well, just imagine hypothetically. Then that would be prohibited by analogy. So obviously the effective cause cannot be that it's filthy. That cannot be the effective cause. What was the number 4 we had? No what? No neck. Yeah, no neck. So no neck to slaughter. Right? We talked about locusts in the last class. Locusts allowed or not allowed? Do they have a neck? Okay. Imam Malik said you have to puncture them or slaughter them or something like that. So, right? And there could be other animals, maybe, perhaps something somewhat similar, like fish, perhaps, or whatever it is. So that can't be the reason, the underlying reason behind it. And number 5 was what? That was number 5. What was number 4? Immune system thing, right? Let's say you find out that there's another animal that has no immune system, or let's say it has AIDS. One of the animals has AIDS. Immune system doesn't work. Has to be prohibited. But health-wise, there's nothing wrong with it if you eat the meat. So that's all of a sudden become prohibited for us. Can't be. So the effective cause cannot be any of these things. The reality is the effective cause of the pig is unknown. It's unknown. Doesn't mean that there's no wisdom behind it. We're going to talk about the difference between wisdom and effective cause. In case you go home and you start having all these doubts or whatever, we're going to talk about that there is wisdom and you can identify the wisdom, but the effective cause and wisdom are 2 separate things. Okay? So there's so you can't apply analogy on a pig, but you can apply analogy on wine, because condition number 2 of analogy means that it has to have an effective cause, and the effective cause must be identifiable. And on pig, it's not identifiable. And on wine, it is identifiable. So there are certain acts which Allah did not indicate any effective cause, which means that you cannot define what the cause is by using your intellect. It's not possible. This is what we call cannot be discerned through the intellect. There's a term for it. It's called غير معقول المعنى. Right? So eating pig, for example, why is pig prohibited? It is prohibited, no doubt about that. Is there a wisdom behind it? Yes, there is. What is the exact reason, specifically why? غير معقول المعنى. We can't pinpoint 100% this so that we can apply analogy. But we know some of the wisdoms of why it's prohibited. And these are all some of the wisdoms. Yes. Because of the hoof. Yes. Yeah. But see, what the Bible's description of it doesn't give us the effective cause. We can't build it. We can't build Islamic law based upon something mentioned in the Bible. Right. So I know the Bible says something, but we can't build it based upon what the Bible says. Yeah. Mentioned. Exactly. It's restricted. Yes. It's restricted. So you can't apply analogy on pig, but you can apply it on wine. Alright, so these are known as غير معقول المعنى, something you cannot figure out through your intellect. Why are they there in the first place? These are considered acts of worship, what's known as ta'abbudi. So why are you staying away from it? I mean, what is the real reason? If Allah didn't tell you exactly, precisely why, what's the point? Well, it's an act of worship as a test for you to stay away from it. So the exact reason specifically is unknown, but the general wisdom can be clearly seen. So for example, there are many things which are غير معقول المعنى or ta'abbudi. There's two terms for it. For example, the number of units in prayer. Why you got to pray 4 units for Zohar and 2 for Fajr? Why not the other way around? Or why not 3? Or why not 5? Or why not 1? You can never figure out specifically the reason for it. But you can see some of the wisdoms behind it. Right? There you can understand that, 1 unit of prayer would just be too easy. It would be too short or something like that. You can figure out that repeating Fatiha 1 more time or getting to recite another surah from a different part of the Quran has a reason for it or something like that. So you can understand some of the wisdoms, but you can't know the exact reason behind it. So that's number of units of prayer is another example. The way that inheritance is distributed specifically in terms of the exact ratio, 1/4 goes to this person, 1/2 goes to this person, 1/3 goes to this person, and the remainder, whatever's left over, goes to this other person. We did inheritance last quarter, right? So the thing is, why that ratio specifically? You're never going to be able to figure out exactly the number, but you can see the wisdom, right? Closer relatives get more than distant relatives, right? Relatives which and you know the wisdom, we talked about the wisdom behind that, because they were closer, they were helping you in your life, you're supposed to be helping them in their life. There's a sense of closer responsibility because of closer blood relationship, all of that stuff. So you can see the wisdom, when you analyze it, you see wisdoms, but you can't figure out the exact details of why this fraction. Why not 1/5 instead of 1/4? Why this specific fraction? You can't figure it out. It's غير معقول المعنى. The had punishment. Right? Had punishment for certain crimes. Right? So certain crimes we talked about in terms of number of lashes. Right? Why 100 lashes? Why not 99? Right? For drinking. Why 40 or 80? Why not 45? Why not 20? Right? You cannot figure out the exact number, the reason, because Allah didn't specify it for you. So these are known as غير معقول المعنى, and there are many other things. So some things which can be known, the effective cause can be known. Some things the effective cause cannot be known because Allah did not give us the means to figure it out. Okay? So if you want to apply analogy, you have to apply it on something which has an effective cause. You cannot apply analogy with the 100 lash rule and say, you know what, this person did this, and you know what, that other action is just as bad. 100 lashes for that person too. You can't do that. Same thing with inheritance. We say, well, inheritance, this guy gets 1/4. Well, if my brother is going to get this much, my best friend was always there for me. So by analogy, he should also get 1/4. Right? If you did that, then you don't really have religion left, because you just make up stuff as you go. So it would be a problem. Number 3, the case that we're dealing with, meaning the original case, must not be confined to the original case, meaning the issue that we're talking about should not be confined to the original case. So for example, permission for the Prophet to marry simultaneously more than 4 wives at once. We talked about that, right? If you say, I'm going to apply analogy, you say, well, you can't even start to apply analogy with anybody because that was specific to only him, right? The impermissibility of anyone marrying the Prophet's widows, right, after his death is specifically restricted to him. So somebody says, well, there's a really, really respected scholar, and we should put the same rule by analogy. You can't do that, because that was specifically only restricted to the Prophet. That's number 3. Rule number 4 is that the case must not be a restricted concession. Concession meaning rukhsa, meaning making things easier for you. Right? And which as many cases in Islamic law which that happens, which only applies to that instance. So let's take some examples. Example of wiping over your socks. In the case, in place of washing over washing your feet during wudu, is with regards to socks. In the loose term or whatever definition of socks, however loose you want to take that term, Right? If it's restricted to that part of the body. If somebody said, you know what? Well, we can just apply analogy. If you can wipe over your socks, and I've heard this many, many times. If you can wipe over your socks, then why can't you just wipe over your hat too? I have like a nice little cowboy hat on. I'm going to wipe over my cowboy hat. Or I'm going to wipe over my kufi. Right? And if you say, okay, well, you know what? If you do that, you might as well, if you're wearing niqab, like sister, you can wipe over your niqab. You say, well, if you can wipe over your niqab, you might as well wipe. My long sleeves have been here the whole time. Might as well just wipe over your arm as well. And if I'm wearing gloves because it's winter, might as well just wipe over the gloves too. So if you could apply analogy based upon wiping over socks to other parts of the body, you could just wipe over everything, right? No problem. Glove, you wear a mask? No problem. Just wipe over your mask. Your Halloween costume or something like that, which you shouldn't be doing in the first place. You got Halloween costume, just wipe over the mask. You know, the Jason mask or whatever you're wearing, you know. You can just wipe over it, no problem. Ski mask, hockey mask or whatever it is. Head, whatever it is. So there, obviously there's going to be a problem. So you cannot apply analogy on something which is a concession that was restricted to that particular circumstance. Like wiping over socks is one example. But you can make an analogy on the socks themselves. You can make an analogy on the socks, because there's a difference between making it on the place and making it on the socks. So the hadith, okay, it mentions, at least all the authentic hadith mention what's known as khuf. And khuf is a type of leather sock, socks made of leather. So can you wipe over socks which are not made of leather? Let's say they're made of wool, they're made of cotton, they're made of all sorts of other things, and it's kind of funny. I did one of my research dissertations on this issue. Scholars literally, they talked about every type of imaginable sock in existence. So they said, what if the sock is made of wood, metal, glass? I'm like, what the heck? How can you have a glass sock? How could you have a wooden sock exactly? But anyways, it's just interesting, because this has really been discussed. Like scholars, they go and they look and they say, let's look at every single possible type of material that can exist. Which ones would we be allowed to apply analogy to? Which ones would we not be allowed to apply analogy to? And just the metal one and the glass one, I just can't get my mind around it, because it would be stuck on your foot forever, right? Like a cast, yeah, I know, but a cast is a different word in Arabic. It's jabira. They're talking about the word jawrab, which is made of glass. So I'm like, how in the world would you even have a glass sock? I don't even know if it exists or not, or they were just talking hypothetically. But anyways, that happens sometimes in books. Anyways, what it's made of, you can apply analogy. And scholars have done that. Scholars have done that. So for example, scholars of the Hanafi school, scholars of the Hanbali school, we talked about it in Islamic Law 1, they looked at the leather sock and they said leather is a strong material. Any other strong material, right, that's, you can walk around in and it's not going to rip or something, like wool, for example. Like wool, this is perfectly fine because it's similar to leather, it's strong enough, it can achieve the same objectives and all of that. So the thing is, this means that the wiping over the socks has an effective cause. It's not like pig, where you don't know the effective cause. There is an effective cause that scholars have identified. Okay, they said there is an illah. But the illah, or the effective cause, is not broad enough that you can start applying it to your hand and to your face and to your head and stuff like that. But you can apply analogy on the sock itself, right? And that's something which many scholars have done. So I hope you're getting the point that, just because we say you can apply analogy doesn't mean it's easy to do. You can slip and mess up very, very easily if you really don't know what you're doing. So this is a big topic. It's a very important topic, yeah. No, that's right. That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. So let's see, that's one example. Another example is someone who travels. This is a concession. So someone who's traveling and they're shortening the 4-unit prayer to 2-unit prayer. This is allowed in Islam. When you're traveling, you can shorten all your 4-unit prayers, which are Dhuhr, Asr, and Isha, to 2 units instead. If you say, well, I'm going to apply analogy, right, and my Fajr prayer is 2, it's going to become half, it's going to become 1. And my Maghrib prayer, I'm going to actually bust out a 1.5 unit prayer. This is like, straight from analogy, I'm going to pull out a 1.5 unit prayer, exactly in line with analogy. Obviously, it's not going to be allowed, right? Also, if somebody comes and says, well, hey, if I can shorten my prayers while I'm traveling, then while I'm fasting and traveling, I can just fast half the day. I'm good to go, right? And then you could just keep on going. So you know what? I'm actually traveling and it's really tough for me. I'm going to pay 1.25% zakah because I'm having the zakah, right? So you can just keep on going and doing all these things. Obviously, and you can imagine there will be people who make these kind of analogies. These are unacceptable analogies, and you understand why now. You can actually explain it. You understand it, and you can explain it to someone who's willing to sit there and listen to you for an hour giving a lecture on analogy, like we're doing today. And then we're going to add another 3 hours, to continue this chapter. Just leave the questions, inshallah, until the end. I'll give you time in just a few minutes. So that's number 4. Number 5, the effective cause, or the illah, must apply in exactly the same way to the new case as it did in the original case. So let's take an example. And here's the example I told you I was going to give you. Someone makes an argument that, look, you know what? There's this new coffee. It's highly, highly potent. Super strong coffee. Right? It's like Sheikh Muhammad Faqih's coffee, when he goes to Coffee Bean. Really powerful, right? So you go there and you say, this coffee causes this, almost like this state of intoxication. When I drink it, I'm just like, almost like, I just get this feeling, almost like I'm drunk. Notice the words, almost like I'm drunk. See, therefore, you know what? You guys are making this argument that, oh, we can't drink wine and blah, 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 intoxicated. This guy's drinking that coffee, right? So if you're going to allow that, you should allow this. And if you're not going to allow that, you shouldn't allow this, or whatever it is. Right? You hear these arguments. I've heard this before. Can you apply it? No, you can't. Someone says, there's this exotic chocolate that comes from, I don't know, from wherever, from the rainforest of Brazil. And it gives you, when I eat it, it gives me this state of euphoria. It's like I just took heroin or something. I just super high. I'm just like in another world. It's like a state of intoxication for me. So therefore, can you say that it's also prohibited because it's causing this, addiction or this, whatever it is? No, because it's not like being drunk. It's not like intoxication, because this is known as an analogy with a discrepancy. And the term is qiyas ma'al fariq. And scholars use this term a lot. Analogy with the discrepancy. Okay? Meaning there's a discrepancy, meaning you didn't apply the analogy correct. The reason is the effect of the coffee or the effect of the chocolate, no matter how close it comes to you feeling like you're being intoxicated, it's not going to cause intoxication in a similar way or in a very similar way that the wine or the vodka or the other alcohol or the drugs may. It's not the same thing. Even though you kind of feel like it's almost there, right? It's not the same thing. All right, so we'll stop right here at the illah, effective cause, and we'll take questions. So questions, yes, first question. Such as? Okay, so you're saying scholars oftentimes they start debating on topics like wiping over socks. Why don't they spend more time focusing on more important topics like alcohol or something like that? The answer is, the reason is because scholars don't just do one thing. Right? there has to be someone who's discussing different issues, right? Like in a university, there are different faculties and different departments, right? If someone says, well, you know what, I think the most important department is political science department because it's going to lead to world peace. Let's shut down all the other departments. Say, well, no. The other departments also have a very important function, and if they get neglected, there's going to be a problem. Same thing with these issues. Wiping over socks is an important issue, should not be neglected. Drinking is an important issue, should not be neglected. Interest is an important issue. Even how you pray is an important issue. Fasting is an important issue. Zakah is an important. These are all important issues. So none of them should be neglected, right? So if you see someone specifically only focusing on one thing, and there's no need at all to focus on it, then there you could blame the person. Otherwise, you can't sit there and blame people. You know, I hear this oftentimes. I want to clarify this. I hear sometimes say, you know what, a khutbah on prayer, everybody knows how to pray. Does everyone concentrate in prayer, first of all? Second of all, does everyone really know how to pray? It depends on where you are in your environment. Now, if this guy gave 52 khutbahs in a row only on prayer, then yes, okay, there's an issue, needs to be dealt with. But sometimes we overgeneralize. We get very very emotional. We say, well, okay, you should talk about civil liberties and civil rights. Now, if somebody goes and gives 52 khutbahs on civil liberties and civil rights in a masjid, and they don't talk about anything else, people don't know how to pray, they don't know how to give zakah, they don't know any spirituality, there's also no balance there. So there has to be a balance across the board. Hopefully that answers the question. Who else had a question? Yes.
With smoking cigarette now, as the generally
Yeah. Yeah.
that is an example of consensus on probably.
I wish. So smoking cigarettes, is there a scholarly consensus ijma on its prohibition? Unfortunately, there's not. I really wish there was, because it's very clearly proven to have such harmful effects. But there's not. And I have a very good theory on why there's not, but I don't have time to explain that theory right now. I didn't give the answer about skipping class and going to Jummah or vice versa, because we discussed it in Islamic Law 1. I know. Take that class, inshallah, you get the answer. Khalil. Okay, so I said that it's claimed that there's a scholarly consensus that you need wudu to touch the copy of the Quran, but it's not there. That was also discussed in Islamic Law 1, but it's only Arabic Quran. Okay. You have a question? No. Yeah. 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 So the third condition for analogy, the case should not be confined to the original case, which means the example is Prophet was simultaneously married to more than 4 wives, but it was only allowed for him. Therefore, even if there was an illah or an effective cause, that effective cause can never be applied to anyone else or any other case, because this was restricted to him only. So for example, we talked about fasting. He used to fast simultaneously 2 days in a row, right? So if you say, well, you know what, he did that because he was strong. So therefore, the effective cause was his strength. If we find someone who's so strong, they can do the same thing, doesn't mean that they're allowed to do it, because that was confined to him, and it was clearly specified that it's confined to him. So no matter what, even if we identify an effective cause, we cannot apply it to anyone else. Okay. Yes. Yeah, that's outside the scope of this class. Ask me afterwards, inshallah.
Buying and selling, doing
Hmm. Oh yeah. When I talked about buying and selling being invalid transaction during Friday prayer, invalid transaction is prohibited and invalid. It means haram. So the thing is, there's haram and there's invalid. So when something is haram, for example, it's haram for you to steal, right? Okay, but let's say you steal and then we catch you and you say, okay, I'm going to ask Allah for forgiveness. But you keep the thing that you stole, right? Stealing is invalid, which means it's haram, it's prohibited for you, and once we catch you, that thing doesn't actually belong to you. So you can ask Allah for forgiveness, but that thing is being taken back to you because that transaction, that theft, did not count. It was not valid in actual practice. Invalid means haram plus something else. Okay? Yeah. What is the criteria for being mujtahid? We talked about it. It's relative in the sense that it's going to be defined differently by people. It depends on how it's being defined. So now it's even more of a problem because there was more understanding and agreement of what mujtahid meant. Today, there's two groups, to be honest with you. Let me explain. There's two groups. One group says, to be mujtahid, you need to be a master of the Arabic language and Arabic poetry and everything. And you need to be a master of, and before you even get to the second point, if you wanted to master Arabic the way that it was mastered in the past, you're not going to do anything else with your life. So don't even bother talking about mastering any other subject. It's literally going to take your whole life. So therefore, they say, in that case, no one can ever be a mujtahid today. Can't exist. Because even if you want to specialize in one thing or the other, just focusing on one of them will take your entire life. So therefore, you're never going to get to the next subject or all the other subjects we're going to be listing for you. So therefore, there's no mujtahids. That's one group. The second group says, look, this is such exaggerated characteristics. No one can ever be in that state. No one can ever, reach this level. In reality, scholars were not at such a high level as you're claiming, because they didn't spend their whole life just learning the language, right? Even though they had it naturally, doesn't mean that. So what they're saying is, they say it can be done. All you need to do is you study this science, you study this science, you study this science, and you become a mujtahid. And other people say you can become a mujtahid in a particular issue. So this is a very common thing. So they say if you write your PhD thesis on one topic, you're a mujtahid in that topic because you're a specialist in that topic. Right? You spent 6 years, right? If you're in America, 6 to 8 years. If you're in the UK, 2.5 to 3 years, which is why I would do my PhD in the UK. But anyways, 2.5 to 3 years, just focusing on that topic. Right? So you're a specialist in that. So that's that. These are the different opinions here. Okay. Second question. That was your first question?
Yeah.
First question.
So from what I was understanding, that there are basically universal formality, regions of the world. But when the universal formality is practically is that what you're saying?
Qat'i. Yeah, certain. Yeah, universal ijma' is the one that's certain. But specified to one locality is not qat'i. The universal ijma'. That is the proof we're talking about, yeah. Any other questions? Any online questions? Our two viewers online? Nope. Okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك الله ونتوب إليه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.